Welcome to the most important week of the year for the podcast industry. Welcome to Podcast Movement 2025.
Good day. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started here on our panel. They're just not that into you, and podcast data can tell you why. What we're going to try and help you understand is, if you're a podcaster, you're a producer, or you're an advertiser, and understanding exactly how listeners and viewers are interacting with your podcast. So we're going to try and help you identify what are the listener and viewer drop-offs and kind of what that reveals about what you're doing, your episodes. And especially, this panel is here to help you figure out the metrics that really matter when diagnosing that content fatigue. And they're going to help you with some proven tactics to reduce churn, because no one wants to be making butter with their podcast, right? You want to keep those listeners tuned in and to keep them coming back week after week. I'm Paul Riismandel. I'm president of Signal Hill Insights. We are an audio-first market research company. We work in audience insights, helping podcasters, advertisers, and publishers understand who is tuning in, as well as the podcast audience at large. And we work in ad effectiveness, help you know if and how your ads are working. We've got a great panel here. I'm really pleased to have joined me here. I'll have everyone introduce themselves very quickly. I'll start with you, Stephanie.
Great, thank you. I'm Steph. I'm the VP of Product at Quill and Cohost. Quill is an agency that works with Fortune 500 brands to start their shows from inception to growing them out on the listening apps, and Cohost is our hosting and measurement platform to help them hit their KPIs.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Good.
Oh, yeah.
My name's Chris Avello. I'm the VP of Marketing at Libsyn. I'm the newbie here. I've been at Libsyn for 5 months and in the podcast space for just 5 months. But I've been lucky enough to learn a lot from my team and fellow leaders. Also have 13 years of experience at Audible, so I spent a lot of my life thinking about the how, why, and when people listen to spoken word audio.
Yeah, and I'm Rosemary Scalabrino. I'm the Director of New Business at Oxford Road. Before New Business, I was a media buyer and then have been in this space for quite a long time, doing advertising sales at Cadence 13 Odyssey.
Wonderful. So you definitely have a brain trust here. I hope you're taking notes. I'll start off with a general question for everybody. So let's play out a scenario. Let's say a podcast has solid downloads, but when you're looking in and looking deeply at your stats and say Spotify or Apple, you're seeing there's high early drop-off, right? People are dipping out early on in the episode. Steph, what's the first thing you'd look at to try and diagnose this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I would look at is time codes. So in Spotify, you can see the time code in which someone has dropped off. So firstly, I would listen to that and see, was there a moment that someone could have possibly dropped off? And I think you have to take your bias out of it, especially if you're the creator, and really think of it objectively. I remember a good example of this is we were producing a podcast for sick kids back in the day, and there was a lot of medical jargon in the intro, and we had a huge drop-off that happened in this episode, and we were all trying to figure out why, and it happened to be at this point where we had a quote from a doctor that was talking about all of this really heavy medical jargony stuff, and it was a narrative-based show that kind of any average person was tuning into. And so I think they ultimately thought, well, this show is probably too over my head, tuned out, and then that was that, and then you lose the listener, right? So I think looking at that is probably the first step that I would take.
Use your ears.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Chris, you work with at Libsyn thousands and thousands of podcasters. How do you help them out with this?
So I would, on the topic of like early drop-off, like I would say take a look at the structure of your opening. Are you diving in with a cold open? Are you using teasers? And maybe more specifically, like, are you getting people engaged before a run of ads? I think we've all had that experience as a listener. You hit play on something new. You're 3 ads into it. You don't even know what you're listening to yet. And I think there's like a thing, it's like a penny smart, pound foolish thing that some people do sometimes. I think going too heavy on that front might be limiting your audience growth. So do you want to monetize 3 ads with 1,000 people, or 10,000 people with 1 ad? And just be really thoughtful about how you structure that.
Yeah, that's interesting because, podcasting it's an opt-in medium, right? We don't channel surf podcasts in that way. At the same time, there's also a lean back experience. Someone may have their podcast queued up, they're on a plane, their podcasts are coming at them, help them know what's going on. So Rosemary, you're looking at this from the advertiser's perspective.
Yes, I am. And I had the same thing about ad load as well, which is, podcasting was always said it's a lean in medium, it's an ad light medium. That's why we are, people are so excited to tune in. We've kind of moved away from being such an ad light medium. And so I think some of the listener drop off is exactly what you said, where it's, 5 minutes of content and then like 3 minutes of ads. And, consumers of media are looking to tune out ads. That's why there's the model of, paying for content without ads. So you have to be really intentional of where you place these ads. And then from a media buying perspective, ad load is a really important thing that we look at, because sometimes our ad will be in the 45-minute mark of the podcast. We don't want listeners to drop off and not be able to hear that ad at the 45-minute mark. So we look at ad load and make sure that, is there 4 ads in a show and they're nicely, neatly placed, or is it 10 ads, jammed in, and it's a mix between pre-produced and host read, and there's no real method to where the ads are going. So,
and following up on the ad sense there, what's the most common misperception that brands have when they see that performance dip in a show? What are they thinking that you see commonly that maybe they should be rethinking?
That they think that the audience doesn't work. But I think before we cut bait on a show, there's so many different levers that we can pull using data to help us inform the levers that we pull to make the show work. And whether that is creative, right? I think that is a data point that we use to make sure that listeners are retaining the ad and not skipping the ad and, listening to the full podcast. So, we've been on shows for 5 to 6 years, right? And so, how do you retain the listeners to want to buy the product, right? There's levers you pull, and creative is a major one. And so we use data with creative to say, okay, well, we're seeing a different performance. Should we switch up the creative? Was it when the host talked about traveling or being on vacation? And prior ads, was that really moving the needle? Okay, let's bring that back in. So using the data points there to help, retain.
How are you obtaining some of that data? So certainly you're again, using your ears, which is really important. Be a listener. Listen to your podcast as a listener. What other kind of sources of data are you using when you're evaluating that creative?
Yeah, we're looking at pixel tracking, right? We're seeing
so attribution in particular,
super important. We've at Oxford Road, we've created a proprietary system called Audiolytics, where it's a mix between AI listening and human in the loop listening to pull out data points of what is making the creative better. There's a couple of different things that we look at, and as well just listening, humans in the loop listening to ads.
Great. So Chris, you work with just a wide range of shows at Libsyn, probably every possible type of show you're working with. So how are you seeing publishers and networks use analytics to inform kind of editorial decisions or like even format decisions?
I think nearly everyone at Libsyn, particularly in the biz dev marketing teams, even our BI team had like really great examples here when I was preparing for today. Here's one that I thought was pretty cool. So a movie-centric podcast that had always used the first 5-10 minutes or so to round up movie news before moving on to more specific topics. Just an idea they had when they were speccing out the show, designing it. It felt right. They enjoyed doing it. They started getting a little bit more sophisticated, looking at data. They learned there was a lot of audience drop-off there. So despite the love for that segment, after trying a few things, they ultimately decided to cut. And with that went better completion rates, less drop-off. The thing that I actually like about the example, though, and why I want to pinpoint that one is I think what they inadvertently did by cutting that recent news segment is make their show more evergreen. So And I think that's something to think about. If your show is getting a lot of downloads in the back catalog, congrats, like you have evergreen content. And if you're not, you might want to think about format changes like what I mentioned that could help you have more of a perennial, more of an evergreen catalog. And that can play into what your ad strategy is if that's the kind of show you have. If you have evergreen listening, things like programmatic, things like dynamic ad insertion probably make a lot of sense for you, maybe less so for baked-in host-read ads. Maybe that doesn't work for something that's of the moment. So
That's a fascinating insight. So one of the things we've learned at Signal Hill with some of our audience research in our semi-annual survey called The Download is listeners tell us that they go into the back catalog. They catch up on the one hand for episodes that they miss. Also, they tell us when they start a new podcast, they go back and dig in, right? They like to try and understand how did the podcast kind of get where it is. And also they're like, hey, maybe there are topics, there are guests that I'd like to explore. And as a listener to podcasts now for a couple of decades, I've seen this shift away from, it used to always be, and maybe many of you remember this, at the beginning of the podcast, the hosts come together and there's a little bit of BSing, basically, like, hey, how's your week? What are you doing? Blah, 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 blah. And it takes them minutes and minutes and minutes to get to the meat of it, right? And, when podcasting was new, great, right? When it was the paradigm of a couple of guys drinking beers in their basement, I hope we've gotten a little past that paradigm now. Sure, that was fine. But when you really need to hang on to the listeners, and you're listening to 10 podcasts, if they all do that, after a while, you're like, come on, right? So I love that you saw that in the data, right? And then tested it with this podcast, and they were able to come through, change it up, and see those results. Because I think that's a fantastic thing. When you're doing a podcast, right, you should be doing more than one episode, right? And so you have an opportunity to test and to see how things work. So Steph, you've got a platform that allows you to see that you're really trying to fill in the gaps in podcast analytics, right? To really help your clients get a deeper view on how your podcasts are being consumed and used. So what's a listener metric you think creators still ignore really at their own risk?
It's interesting because when I was thinking about this question, I was like, what metrics do people really ignore? And I would say it's not necessarily that people are ignoring metrics. I think at this point, there's a lot of data out there that both of you pointed to as well. I think what the issue is that there's almost so much data that it's hard to know what do I pay attention to and how do I derive insights from that and how do I tell myself a data narrative that makes sense that I can action on, right? So I think in the future, that's really where AI is going to help come into play, is looking at all of this data and this fragmented data and making sense of it so that way we can actually create appropriate actions and save time ultimately in terms of doing things that are the most effective. If I had to point out a metric that I do find, folks maybe ignore a bit, I would say is more so on the maybe demographics or audience feedback side. More so in that, not that people aren't looking at the demographics of their show from a from a post-publication standpoint, but more so I think from a proactive standpoint. So how can I get feedback to fuel the content beforehand, right? How can I, ask my audience what they want to hear ahead of time? Is it when I'm dropping episodes, am I asking them, what guest is it going to be and getting them to guess in the comments? That's something that's really interesting, that you can get lots of feedback on what guests folks want to hear from that way without actually asking them for a survey. Polls on Spotify are really interesting now that have been opened up. So I think taking a look at, all the resources that we have out there and figuring out how can I create a reciprocal relationship and community with my audience so they're telling me what they want to hear, in addition to me then measuring the audience as well once they do hear it.
And it sounds like there's a really good side effect to doing that, right? Because that's engagement, right? And that's, one, what your audience is actually looking for from you, as well as what you want back from them is that engagement. You want them to lean in. At Signal Hill, we run a lot of audience surveys. We run a lot of audience surveys with podcasters and with publishers. And sometimes they worry, and maybe you heard this, like, oh, we're asking the listeners to do something. Oh, we can't do that, right? But yet, what do you find with that? When you, it's like they want to help, they want to tell you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's about being a little sneaky with it sometimes. So, survey, yes, sometimes they absolutely want to help you. And if there's an incentive in there, amazing. They're absolutely going to, probably fill out a form. But I think there's also ways that you can do it where, you're meeting your listeners where they are. There's been a lot of talks about that at this conference about, the different mediums. Podcasting isn't just audio anymore. So, meet them on TikTok, on Instagram, on newsletter, wherever it is. And then think about how you can engage them on those mediums, right? Because that's actually where they can comment and they can engage, because someone can't necessarily leave a comment on their every listening app, right? So that might be a good way for you to start collecting feedback.
Absolutely. Circling back to you, Chris, because, Libsyn, again, you're dealing with just kind of every kind of podcast that exists. So what role do you see that, like, format of a podcast and maybe even that host delivery, what does that play in listener retention?
It's super important. And like we talked about earlier, you can test in this space. And I think not everybody always knows what that means. So I'll put on like my performance marketing hat. Testing doesn't mean like, oh, I have a cool idea, like I'm going to try something. Like it could be that, but I would recommend being a little bit more deliberate. Like, what metric do you want to influence? Let's say it's completion time. Develop a hypothesis. Like, how can I increase completion time? I don't know. Maybe it's like, how can I put a bonkers like teaser for the weirdest part of the episode in the intro to get people listening to the end? Whatever it is, right? And just like commit to it. 3 episodes, 4 episodes, whatever it takes to sort of get a read on that. And then hopefully you get a clear read and can make a decision. And then, you've used data, you've developed a hypothesis, you've done it in like a thoughtful way. Sometimes, unfortunately, like all kinds of digital testing like this, you might not get clear results. They might be murky. That's just the nature of it. And something that happens with small sample sizes with testing. At that point, use the data you have, use your qualitative feelings about your show and your audience, and decide whether to keep going or not. But
yeah, systematic testing. I mean, it works. Believe it or not, it works. And I mean, that's what you do. That's what you do in advertising, right, Rosemary? It's test and test and test and test. So I'm wondering what you've seen, right? When you're buying shows and you're evaluating shows, both, I guess, to put on a plan as well as once they've been on a plan. Like, what is that interaction with the format of the show and the way the host delivers things? How does that figure into your reasoning? What are you looking for?
I'm going to bring it up again, but we definitely look at ad load and how ads are delivered. I made some notes on this, but I think we need to find a playbook of how to better integrate ads into podcasts as well, so that it's not this like, all of a sudden big jolt of like an O'Reilly's jingle, like right in the middle of a section that feels like, that you're very excited, or you're just on the edge of listening to, who was murdered from a true crime podcast, and then it's just this abrupt ad. So it's something that we take into account when, looking at media buys.
What do you like to hear? Like, what is your ideal when you're listening?
I don't know, because I think we need to do a study, because it's hard, because we think about, well, there's a soft jingle intro, but then that like pings the listener to like start skipping. But then you also don't want to be super erupt with like, a jingle or something that doesn't feel native to the content. So I think we may have a study on our hands of what's the best way to transition a podcast ad into a podcast without losing listenership and also having the listener listen to the ad all the way through. The other note that I wanted to make as well is that if the host is going to do the read, hosts, we need them to do good reads, right? They're so authentic about their podcast, and then they come and do an ad read and it's just like stale and they don't want to be there. The listener feels that they're going to scan through, or they're just going to drop off. So, hosts are almost like a secondary sales team to these advertisers. Like, we want you to be just as excited about beers on the couch as you are about the products that we are putting in your show.
Yeah, I mean, I've tested thousands of podcast ads, and I remember one time, we often say someone is phoning it in. There was one time the host literally phoned it in. Literally, there was a change in sound, and he was on the phone.
Well, no, we literally have had that too. I had someone do an ad read in a YouTube simulcasted podcast, in bed with they literally phoned it in. So yeah, please don't phone it in. You're going to lose your listeners, and then you're going to also, we're not going to get good performance from the brand.
I always think to Mark Maron, who of course we know now is retiring from podcasting, and I worked with the company that represented him for many years, and he sort of had this great way of doing ad reads because he would just be in the middle of a rant, and then all of a sudden start talking about justcoffee.coop, right? Just out of nowhere, but somehow made it work, right? It's like he could take a pause and then go right into an ad. It's an art, though. I'm sure you've heard it. I'm sure you've heard it happen well, and I'm sure you've heard it not so well.
Yeah, there's definitely been pieces where it's awkward, and that wasn't a good transition, and it actually, wasn't good, but yeah.
So, Steph, when you're working with your clients, right, these large companies making their podcasts, how are you advising them on format and host delivery to kind of make sure that they've got that listener retention?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's interesting because I was thinking about this as you were talking as well. And it's, when we think about a study of how to sell a product in a podcast, I almost think the podcast itself needs to be a product and it needs to be fully integrated. So what we do on the branded side is firstly, we're understanding, okay, in the category, how are you going to be the first, the best, or different? How are you going to provide value to the listener? And then how do we take that concept and relate it back to your brand? So an example of this was we worked with a bank, and they were they wanted to spread awareness about their cybersecurity practices. And they're like, we want to do an interview with a cybersecurity expert for 30 minutes, and we're just going to ask them cybersecurity questions, to which we all said, absolutely not. No one's going to listen to that. That sounds awful.
Riveting.
Terrible. Yeah. And so we were like, okay, maybe let's unpack this. Why don't we try something that's a narrative show? So we ended up doing a reply all type show where folks would phone in with their cybercrime issues, and then we would have an expert from their team weigh in on what they would do and how they would solve this problem. And it ended up being one of the top podcasts in technology for a long time, and obviously it helped really spread awareness that the bank was on it with cybersecurity because they had this whole podcast about it, right? And it was an interesting way for folks to learn that, my bank can help me solve these problems, right? So I think it's about, like I said, providing entertainment and value to the listener in a way that's not necessarily an ad, but at the same time, it has that benefit after listening because you're thinking about the brand in a different way. How do we change the mind about the brand with the content?
Next time you do this, could you let me know? Because my dad needs to call in. He's a little too credulous with the FBI agent on the phone with him. But so thinking about retention now, let's shift it over to churn, right? Churn is when listeners tune out. Again, you're here helping a bank make a podcast that people want to listen to, right? Because if you just say, hey, this is a bank podcast, it's hard to get people coming in, but getting their questions answered is a lot more attractive. But you're not holding on to every single listener. And often folks look at the numbers and are like, oh, churn is just terrible. But is it always bad?
I think it depends on what you define as churn. And I also think that in this industry too, as someone who has worked on a hosting platform for 4 years, it's really hard to actually quantify churn in this industry of listeners because we don't necessarily have identifiable information that shows you that this particular individual actually dropped off, right? So I think it's hard to quantify. I will say there's a couple of red flags I would look for is A, if you're looking at your unique listener numbers, not necessarily downloads, but unique listeners, so the individuals that are actually listening, and those are continuously tapering off, maybe not the best sign. Maybe look at your content, but also look at your consumption. Is the consumption also going down? I think those two put together, you can say, okay, this is maybe a negative story that we want to get out of. And if that's the case, then we can work on that, right? And then in terms of churn, I would say niche isn't always a bad thing necessarily. So if you're changing the direction of your show and you've changed the content and the numbers have gone down, but maybe they've stabilized, then that could just be saying that you have a unique audience that you're actually hitting. An example of this, we had a show come on Cohost and they were targeting It was a dental podcast. It was a dental software, and they were talking about dental practices. I know, riveting. But only dentists listened to that, and then we were able to measure that through our analytics and say that it was like all these dental practices that were listening. Really interesting play for them to then go out and potentially have sponsors come in and say, hey, like your dental software, come advertise to these dentists, right? So it's not always a bad thing if your numbers are low, but you don't want them to be declining. Long-winded answer, but I'll pass it.
Yeah, if you're selling x-ray machines, you want to be on that dental podcast. Chris?
Yes, context is sort of really important, right? Like if your show's on a break or you're between seasons, like expect fewer downloads. There's also like the seasonal shedding and seasonal churn, right? Your health and fitness, you're probably going to peak in January, or get a little quiet. Like neither of those are necessarily bad, but it would be bad if you're not paying attention and if you don't realize that exists in your niche. So you have to kind of decide, like, am I cool with that or do I want to buck the trend? And if you're going to buck the trend, you got to be creative. Like you could be the ski shop that closes, April through October, or you could be the ski shop that does kayaks in the summer. Like it's a matter of like what your goals are, just being aware of it and deciding what to do with it, I think is the important thing.
How are you looking at churn, Rosemary, when you're looking at, certainly you're seeing the stats on the ad delivery, right? You know the shows and how many downloads, how many impressions there were. How are you thinking about churn when you're trying to analyze that data?
Yeah, from performance advertiser, I mean, downloads, if I'm buying an ad for performance, and downloads don't necessarily matter as much. Like that story about the dentist and how they're all dentists, like that sounds like a very valuable, loyal audience for a lot of advertisers who are in the dental industry. But I tried to relate churn back to marketing in general and the practice. And I'm really happy that we're talking about this because I think at a lot of other podcast movements, we've talked about how to get new listeners. Let's get new listeners, and it's the same in marketing where we're always chasing that new customer, but we forget about the listeners themselves. What do they want? What are our loyal audience? How do we keep them? And then how do we retain the churned ones who left us, right? So I think we've put in our industry and in marketing in general, a lot of emphasis on the new, not a ton of emphasis on the churn, or the loyal, and then to retain the churned customers. So I think this is a really valuable conversation.
Yeah, it can be very tempting, right, to grow.
Yeah.
But I think also one of the sort of bad temptations is change, and not change for the sort of to hone it, but to sort of say, oh, well, if people are into this now,
yep,
this is where we should go, right? But maybe not. I gave a presentation about the new podcast listener, right? The people coming into podcasting tend to be younger, more multicultural. And someone who did a podcast that's mostly aimed at folks who are 45 plus said, oh my God, should I be changing my podcast to go after this younger audience? And I was like, no, because what you do well is not for that audience, right? You've got a great audience. You should keep pursuing them. You should keep going for it and making it the best podcast you can for them. It's knowing their audience is great.
Yeah, it's a balancing act for sure.
Absolutely. Well, I hope you've learned as much as I have here. It's been a lot of fun to be up here, and I thank you all for joining me on stage, and thank you all for coming.